Yes, Porsche designed and built light aircraft engines in the 1980s, which powered, among others, the Mini M20L. Porsche's PFM 3200 engine was hyped up as a modern replacement for aging engine designs, but only about 80 of these engines were delivered before production ceased. So what happened? Was it a dismal failure of an engine, or were there other factors at play? I won't cover Porsche's full history. I'll focus on the aviation side to remain relevant to the channel. The PFM 3200 that powered the Mini M20L, the engine I'm discussing in this video, was not actually the company's first foray into aviation. For that, we have to go back to 1955. That was the year in which the post-World War II ban on aircraft design and manufacturing in Germany was fully lifted. German aviators wanted to get back in the air, but the country's aviation engine industry had been decimated, and there were limited options for locally produced four-stroke aircraft engines suitable for light aircraft. They realized the Porsche 356's engine, an air-cooled Boxer 4, was a good candidate to be adapted for aircraft use. Although the engine wasn't certified, Porsche provided this engine, the 678, to buyers in an aviation-ready configuration. The 1.6-litre engine produced between 52 and 75 horsepower, depending on the variant, and was a popular option for home-built aircraft. But it also powered Germany's first post-war production aircraft prototype, the Panzer Elster. However, the production variants of the Elster used the more powerful 95 horsepower Continental C90. The 678 engine was built until 1963. Porsche cars started becoming really popular internationally from around the late 1960s, and their racing prowess got better and better, regularly winning endurance races. In 1970, Porsche got their first 24 hours of Le Mans overall win. By 1981, they had been triumphant on 5 more occasions. Porsche was riding high and decided to take their success even higher, in a manner of speaking, by re-entering the aviation market. After all, general aviation had been steadily growing since World War II, and Porsche saw an opportunity. They started development of a modern aviation engine in 1981. Their reasoning for entering the aviation market again was actually fairly sound in theory. They had decades of experience manufacturing reliable performance engines. They also noticed that aviation engines hadn't changed from basic designs dating to the 1940s, and that there was room for a refined modern aero engine with lower emissions, lower noise, easier pilot operation, and better efficiency, which would be welcome with the ongoing oil crisis. They based the design on their air-cooled Boxer 6 architecture, but the PFM was developed specifically as an aviation engine, with almost no parts being shared with their new 3.2-litre 911 engine, which was developed in parallel and would power 911s from 1984. Though the PFM 3200 did have the same bore of 95mm and stroke of 74.4mm for an identical displacement of 3,164 cubic centimeters. Its maximum power of 217 horsepower was produced at 5,300 RPM, which meant a propeller speed reduction unit was required. The propeller speed was reduced by a ratio of 0.442 to 1, for a propeller speed of 2,340 RPM, which would lower propeller noise compared to direct drive engines spinning propellers up to 2,700 RPM. Brake-specific fuel consumption was 260 grams per kilowatt hour. The gearbox casing, shaft and gears were designed for a 10,000-hour life and rated for 300 horsepower. It made use of helical gears to lower noise, and the gearbox was designed to accommodate the hydraulic constant speed propeller system. While the engine was air-cooled, it can easily be mistaken for a liquid-cooled engine, as the usual cylinder cooling fins visible on conventional air-cooled engines aren't visible here. This is partly because the engine was just as much oil-cooled as air-cooled. While all engines get some cooling from oil, the PFM relied heavily on its large volume oil flow for cooling, and the flow was controlled by a thermostat which was very sophisticated for the time. It was a dry sump system and oil was cooled after being scavenged, going through an oil cooler on its way back to the external oil tank. But that doesn't mean it didn't cool with air too. In fact, it made use of forced air cooling, featuring a belt-driven fan placed at the rear of the engine. The fan blows air forward through a ducting system over the cylinders. The cylinders did have cooling fins, though they are not visible without removing some of the covering and ducts. In theory, this forced air cooling had several advantages. One is that cylinder head temperatures were independent of airspeed. For example, a slow climb at full power gets full air cooling since the fan is belt driven by the crankshaft and running at full speed, unlike normal air-cooled engines which get suboptimal cooling in a slow climb. In the same vein, there was no shock cooling when descending, as closing the throttle for descent reduces the amount of cooling from the fan. This is in contrast to conventional engines which get full airflow with the engine not creating much heat. Additionally, no ram air was needed and no cowl flaps were needed. The system did come at a cost though, which I'll get to momentarily. The engine was of course a Boxer 6 like the 911 engine. This means opposing pistons' connecting rods each have their own crankpin rotationally offset by 180 degrees. This is specifically what makes it a Boxer, with opposing pistons mirroring each other, moving outward together and inward together. As a result, the Boxer 6 has almost perfect balance. Don't believe videos or illustrations showing opposing pistons sharing a crankpin like a V engine, with pistons moving together. That's incorrect. Porsche employed a torsional damper at the rear of the crankshaft to reduce torsional vibration. That's the force that attempts to twist the crankshaft along its length, and the length of the crankshaft is one of the factors that determines if one is needed. I've seen this specifically listed as a disadvantage of the Porsche engine, but the competing six-cylinder engines also have torsional dampers, usually the pendulum type. In fact, even some high-power, large displacement four-cylinder Boxers have a torsional damper. The PFM featured an overhead camshaft for each bank of cylinders, with 2 valves per cylinder. Unlike the 911 engine, which used a cam chain, the PFM's camshafts were gear-driven. It used the Bosch K-Jetronic automatic altitude compensating fuel injection system with dual electronic ignition systems for redundancy. In fact, most systems were dual, having 2 alternators and even 2 batteries. Another system doubled up on was the engine control system. This also enabled single lever operation, so no separate mixture control and no separate propeller pitch control. Everything happened automatically based on the throttle setting. Whether you're for it or against it, one thing is for certain: it lightens the workload for the pilot. Yay! A PFM 3200 took flight for the first time in 1982, powering a modified Cessna 182. In 1985, the engine received FAA Part 33 certification, and in the same year, Porsche signed a contract with Mooney to adapt the PFM engine to the Mooney M20L, which would become the most popular application of the engine. To Porsche, Mooney seemed a great fit for their image, which was all about speed. But it also powered several other aircraft, including the Rushmeyer MF-85, of which 3 were built. Others were the Robin DR400 and the MBB 223 Flamingo, though only one Flamingo had the Porsche engine installed. To prove the engine's reliability and demonstrate its real-world performance, a Porsche-powered Mooney flew around the world between 1985 and 1986. The PFM-powered Mooney M20L then went into production in 1988. So, how did it compare to the Mooney powered by other engines? The Porsche-powered M20L would have most closely competed with the M20J and K. The M20L's Porsche power plant put out 217 horsepower and the engine weighed around 200 kilograms. With the PFM engine, the M20L had an empty weight of 887 kilograms. Maximum rate of climb was claimed to be 1050 feet per minute. And while these numbers are supposed to be at max all-up weight, this number was not achievable in the M20L. And some reported max rate of climbs as low as 640 feet per minute when loaded. I've also seen numbers around 800 feet per minute reported at less than maximum all-up weight, and it achieved a cruise speed of 155 knots, consuming 38 liters per hour at about 75% power. Service ceiling was 19,300 feet. The M20K was outfitted with the turbocharged 6-cylinder Continental TSIO 360, which had a maximum power output of 210 horsepower and weighed 180 kilograms. That gave the M20K an empty weight of 818 kilograms. Rate of climb was claimed to be 1,080 feet per minute, and most pilot reports indicate this is actually achievable when heavily loaded. It cruised about 165 knots. It will cruise a bit faster at higher altitudes, but this number is for below 12,000 feet, where the non-turbocharged J and L variants achieves its best cruise speeds, for the sake of comparison. Service ceiling was 24,000 feet, possible since it's a turbocharged engine that maintains full power up to much higher altitudes than naturally aspirated engines. Fuel consumption was 48 liters per hour at 75% power. The M20K clearly outperformed the M20L in everything but fuel consumption. But what about the older J variant? Surely the Porsche engine will compete better against the 4-cylinder Lycoming. The fuel-injected Lycoming put out 200 horsepower, weighed 150 kilograms, and gave the plane an empty weight of 760 kilograms. Maximum rate of climb was claimed to be 1,030 feet per minute, and observed averages all exceeded 800 feet per minute. It had a service ceiling of 18,800 feet. It cruised at about 155 knots with a fuel consumption of about 40 liters per hour at 75% power. Some have said they cruised their M20J at 116 knots easily, but that's usually at higher fuel consumption. This is a much closer comparison, but still the J matches the L in cruise speed at barely higher fuel consumption. And despite claims, the M20J seems to beat the L in rate of climb in real-life scenarios. On paper, the PFM looked like a great engine, but in practice, it just couldn't compete with the Continental-powered M20K, and it didn't exactly blow the older M20J out of the water either. And that's ignoring the brilliant M20M that went on sale in 1989, achieving cruise speeds upwards of 200 knots. Perhaps the M20L's only advantages were lower noise, both cabin and external, lower pilot workload, and slightly better fuel consumption. The Porsche engine was also notably smoother running than the IO360, as boxer force have a rocking couple caused by a secondary imbalance, which I won't get into in this video. So what was going on? The Porsche engine has more power, so why does this not translate into real-world performance? And no, the higher RPM and gearbox were not the problem here. The lower rate of climb usually observed was mostly due to its higher weight. The M20L weighs about 70 kilograms more than the K variant and 130 kilograms more than the older J, mostly due to the higher weight of the Porsche engine and accessories. The heavier engine is due to various factors, including the dual systems like dual ignition, alternators, and batteries. Despite its smaller displacement of 3.2 liters, it's physically a massive engine, matching and exceeding most dimensions of its 5.9 litre or 360 cubic inch competitors. This is in part thanks to its overhead cams, which substantially widens the engine. It's also quite a bit more complex, doubling up on camshafts, for example, and it has that propeller speed reduction unit, which does contribute to an increase in weight, as well as the forced air cooling and ducting system. But what about cruise speed? Unfortunately, the mentioned cooling system with shrouded fan and ducting creates a lot of cooling drag. Even though it's an enclosed system, there's a penalty. With a conventional air-cooled engine, air would enter the cowl, move around the engine and cylinders, flow downward and exit at the bottom rear of the cowl. With the PFM engine, air would go into the admittedly small inlet, but then move back, turn almost 180 degrees to go through the fan and forward over the cylinders before it would exit. That creates massive drag at high speed. Some estimates are that this alone accounted for at least a 12-knot penalty in cruise speed. So were these factors the sole reason for only 41 M20Ls being built before production ceased? Here I need to provide some wider context. General aviation went through a massive slump in the 1980s, with sales and consequently manufacturing numbers dropping significantly. The oil crisis couldn't have helped, though the primary reason was the increasing litigious culture, with the average liability cost in 1988 being about $100,000 per plane. This meant that Porsche re-entered the aviation market at the worst possible time, especially for a company trying to establish itself in a market that was difficult even before the financial slump. To bring the extent of the market downturn into perspective, even light aircraft giants like Piper and Cessna suffered heavily by the mid-1980s. Cessna stopped production of light piston singles in 1986, and Piper eventually filed for bankruptcy by 1991. Piper and Cessna started production again in 1995 and 1996 respectively, but only after the passing of the General Aviation Revitalization Act, which limited manufacturer liability. But the PFM program was long dead by then. So am I saying this is the reason for the PFM 3200's failure? It played a massive role, but we can't ignore issues with the engine itself. Aside from the PFM engine Mooney being less performant in most metrics, the appeal of flying behind a Porsche engine was further reduced by the M20L's price tag. In 1988, this was about $63,000 more than the M20J, and about $13,000 more than a fully equipped M20K. The Porsche engine alone cost around double that of the M20K's Continental. But Porsche's argument here was that the additional cost would be recovered in just 1,200 hours of flying due to fuel savings. Some lazy maths on my part shows that for the M20L compared to the M20J, to recover that extra $63,000 with a fuel saving of only 2 liters per hour, you would need to fly roughly 96,000 hours to make back that money, which is not realistically possible. Compared to the M20K, there's a much bigger fuel saving of 10 liters per hour, but still you would need to fly 4,100 hours to recover the $13,000 higher cost of the M20L in fuel cost alone. That's ignoring any differences in maintenance costs. With a 2,000-hour TBO, you'd recover the cost only after your second engine overhaul. And we didn't even take into account that the M20K cruises about 10 knots faster at the fuel burn number we used. That means it spends fewer hours flying to reach any destination than the slower M20L. So if working on cost per mile instead of cost per hour, it would be even more than 4,100 hours to recover that additional $13,000. It's possible I made a mistake with my math, or maybe Porsche just used different airplane cost and fuel burn numbers than I did. But it just doesn't seem achievable at all to recover that additional cost. Also note that I didn't consider maintenance costs in my calculations, which I can't imagine being cheaper on the Porsche, being a much more complex engine. Not to mention, mechanics needed special training, so the support network was much smaller compared to Continental and Lycoming. I did consider the possibility that Porsche used the cost of cheaper MOGAS instead of avgas in their calculations. While the PFM was initially designed to run on both avgas and MOGAS, compression ratio was later increased on the certified version powering the Mooney, likely when Porsche became aware of the lacking performance, which meant that MOGAS, which is lower octane, couldn't be run anymore. Porsche was confident it could eventually increase TBO to 3,000 hours, and that would have added some credibility to these claims. But we never got to that point. Porsche did have plans to make the engine more attractive, where emissions and noise were already becoming a problem in Europe. The lower noise of the PFM engine was a selling point here, and Porsche also had plans to fit a catalytic converter to lower emissions. But for that to come to fruition, the engine would first have needed to be commercially successful. With the $75 million it cost Porsche to design and deliver about 80 engine units, the engine and the M20L needed to basically fly off the shelves, so to speak, to recover that cost. Of course, they didn't, and in late 1989 the program was cancelled. Porsche did offer limited support for the engines up to 2005. My guess is, had there not been a general aviation recession, PFM production volumes could have roughly doubled, but production lines would ultimately still have closed, perhaps a year or two later. Had the engine not been as expensive, the appeal of flying behind a Porsche engine, even with less performance than other options, may have saved the program. Or perhaps if it had outperformed other variants, many would have been willing to part with more money for an M20L. But neither of those things happened. Aside from its cost, lack of performance and the general aviation downturn, another big reason for failure to be adopted in greater numbers was the reduction gearbox. This seems like a direct contradiction to what I said earlier. Let me explain. The problem wasn't the gearbox itself. It was well engineered, and we know that geared engines can match and in some cases exceed the reliability of direct drive engines. Rotax has proven this, backed up by statistics. The problem was the aviation community's cultural distrust of geared engines after some historical failures. According to what I could find online, of the 41 Mooney M20Ls that were produced, only a handful remain still sporting its Porsche engine. There are still a few more around in other aircraft as well as in museums. You can see an example for yourself in the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart, the Technik Museum in Speyer, and the only PFM version of the MBB 223 Flamingo is on display at the Deutsches Museum Luftfahrt Schleichheim. What do you think of the PFM 3200 and the Mooney M20L? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.